Michael. You're very welcome in Aberystwyth. Michael's going to talk about packing aspects when self-assembling spheres. So for you to be able to see that, I need to do that. And I think we're good to go.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Simon and to Adil for organizing this wonderful workshop here in Aberystwyth. The first time for me to be in Wales. And it's really lovely here. A lot of space and a lot of green and really nice here. Okay, so I want to speak about this title. So spheres. So we will look at only spheres today. Actually, next week I will talk about other shapes in the conference, but today is only about spheres. And maybe coming to what Dennis said yesterday, in my talk there will be more ordered structures. So I also like the disordered structures, but one of the goals of my research is to understand how we get from disorder to order, and that's what I will speak about from different aspects. And a lot of things I will speak about also have connections to experiments. So I will show a lot of pictures of minerals, of stuff that I'm a simulator, I should say at the beginning. So we only do computer simulations. So we write code for simulations, perform simulations, analyze simulations. So that will be my contribution. All the experimental images are not from me, but from collaborators. Okay, let's see. So I have two parts in my talk. First part is on polydispersity, and the second part is on what I call magic number clusters, and I will tell you later what that means. And there are several subparts also in these parts, and I will see how we get through with the time. But please interrupt me anytime, and we can have a lively discussion, I hope. So for polydispersity, that starts with the first image here from a mineral. This is a gem opal from Australia. So opal, that's essentially SiO2, so silicon dioxide, together with water. And you see they have very nice shiny color. And I think we'll hear more about colors in the afternoon by Rini when we talk about structural color. On the crystal, that's what you see here, is structural color. So the material has a certain periodicity, certain short-range structure, and that short-range structure gives rise to superposition of waves to structural color. And when you look inside, when you take an electron microscope, you look inside, that's how it looks like. That's not exactly this opal, that's another one. Actually, this is one from California. I found on the internet. There are these small balls, they're the silicate, and they are sort of connected and form some ordered structure. And some of them are more ordered, some are a little bit less ordered. So even for disordered ones, you get some structural color, but whereas this one is like GEM quality opal, so that's the nice one that sells for high price in the market, and that one is like a lower quality because it still has some short range order, but it doesn't have this nice long range order, so it doesn't get so nice color. So, and what got me started on this project was this work from very old work 40 years ago when I saw this, and apparently there are also opals which are like binary. So you see here is this was 40 years ago, so like the electron microscopes at that time were much actually this is cut, this is not look inside, they cut it and then they sort of see here the different particles, and the quality of is, as I said, much lower. So here you have large particles and small particles, so it's pretty regular. So you have rows of large particles, rows of small particles, and they alternate. Here's another one. This one's actually called an AB2 crystal. This one is an AB13 crystal. So here's the unit cell, so it repeats. It's pretty complicated. And then when you look at this, you might wonder, how does nature make binary crystals? Because why would nature make large and small spheres? Where does this come from? So what you would maybe think, well, if you make spheres, maybe there's a process which makes spheres like this, some large, some small, like a polydispersed sample. And how do you get from here to here? And that's the question that I ask myself. And I'm not sure what I will tell you is exactly the process that happens in nature, but at least it gives you an idea how we can actually get binary crystals from polydispersed samples. So here's the distribution that I will look at in this talk. So it's a Gaussian distribution. So here you have radii, here's the distribution over here. And I have a simple Gaussian distribution, but everything I say can also have a a different distribution. That's just the simplest one I started out from.
But they're really just dispersed objects of the same material. There's no like
Here?
chemical difference between the large and the small.
Yeah, they're all just it's opal. It's just yeah, it's just essentially silicon. Okay, yeah, how is this possible? So now let's come back to simulations. So when you have this polydisperse mixture or size dispersed mixture, because the dispersity is in the size rather than in the composition or the shape, then you can perform simulations. You can do that with hard spheres. So hard spheres, that just means there's excluded volume interaction, no other interactions. And here you will see similar diagrams like this a lot. So you have here the volume fraction. So that's the percentage of space that's filled with material. Typically, as a rule of thumb, at 50% is where things start to order, and that's independent of the shape, of the composition. It's pretty universal at roughly 50%, sometimes at 60%, but in that range. So here's how dense you pack space, and here is the dispersity. So usually, for those that know the hard sphere model, they will know this axis. So here you just have density, and then you have a fluid. So the system is disordered. As you increase it, between 50 and 55%, there is a coexistence. 49 to 54 is a coexistence, but in simulation, starting at 54%, you get hard sphere crystallization, and then you can get it here. And if you actually start the simulation at 60, I think to 63 or higher, it's already jammed, so you cannot actually study crystallization in simulation. So that's well known. Then if you add dispersity with this Gaussian distribution, you see it gets harder to form crystals. So here the density goes up, and then at one point, well, it also goes down again. So there's this bump here. They're all FCC crystal. So very simple periodic packing, the packing you know from packing oranges in the supermarket. So we have a glass fluid, and that has been known for like a long time. This is one exemplary work where this was taken from. And so you see there's nothing sort of special happening, except roughly at 5 to 6% dispersity becomes impossible to find crystals. Then people thought in theory, they thought, yeah, what could happen if we actually go higher? Maybe the simulations just don't run long enough. Maybe we just have to wait for more time, or we have to, we have to do something else. And then this is sort of one hypothesis that was discussed in the 20 years ago, 98 to 2010. There are a lot of papers on this. This is just a few examples. And the consensus from this approach was, well, we have here this S solid. That's what we saw. And then if you go higher, you get this multiple crystals. So it looks like this. You have, for example, one crystal where all the large particles go, one crystal with the smaller one, and this is called fractional crystallization. It's actually a process that's well known also in geology and in other cases. And if you look at an opal, it has a lot of different colors. Maybe you can convince yourself that's a plausible process. And then what people did here is they used the density function theory to estimate the free energies and argue that this is one process. There are also other theories. I just picked out 3. There are several ones. So already in 99, Kofke and Bolhus, they say, well, but we can also have quasi-compounds. That's essentially what we saw before. You can have binary crystals where the large particles play the role of the larger part of the distribution, play the role of the large particles, and the smaller part of the distribution play the role of the small particles. So you have the AB, AB2, AB13 compounds. Well, that was pure speculation at that time. They had nothing to back this up. And then in 2016, there were also experiments which actually found Labbe spaces. So that's an AB2 crystal in charged size-dispersed SiO2 spheres. So that's the same as the opals, the same material. However, they're sort of charged, and they have different charge and different particles, and so at least there was some crystallization in polydispersed particles. And then there were other work. I found this work quite interesting here from 2007, which performed simulations, and they saw something like this, and they didn't really know what to make of it, and they called this as density inhomogeneity. So here there's some disorder, but that actually looks already pretty ordered. And if you compare it to what we saw before, it almost looks like there is some crystal forming. But this was a very small part of the simulation, and they didn't really know what's going on And they used the soft interaction potential, so not quite the hard potential. But what they also did to get here, they used something called a local swap Monte Carlo algorithm. So that means they swap particles. And that brought me to the idea, well, let's do something like this, but a couple swaps with event-driven MD. So event-driven MD is essentially the same, is follows the trajectory of the particles. So you see here a very slow simulation where the particles, they move in ballistically until they collide. And then when they collide, you try to swap the radii of the two spheres. That's why you see here the radii getting larger and smaller all the time. This idea of swapping particles is already a little bit old. So the first paper I found was from '89, when Frankel and Cranendonk, they talked about this idea of swapping particles, and Ludovic Berthier recently has done a lot of work with swapping particles to relax glasses better and to reach timescales that you cannot reach with other methods. And it's a pretty established method. The thing that we added is this idea when they collide, we swap at that time, and that adds a little bit more performance. And actually, these are super. You can relax systems super fast. And then just to show that, I have this graph here. So what you see here is a comparison of performing simulations with swap, without swap. So this is here pressure. So here's time. First of all, this is a relatively short simulation. So 70,000 times here with 1,000 particles took me 1.5 hours. Actually, on this laptop, I ran this a few weeks ago on this laptop, and so this is relatively short simulation. And we use pressure as a means of analyzing the progress of the simulation. It turns out when you start at the beginning, the pressure is pretty high because the particles are pretty jammed together and they're pretty unhappy. And as you go on, the particles make more space for themselves, so they get more ordered, and then the pressure drops. And pressure is, in all of these simulations, is a pretty good indicator for the progress of ordering or of relaxation. So you see here for no swap in purple, there's a pretty sharp drop, and then sort of it goes down pretty slowly. This is at 60%, so pretty high density, 12% dispersity, so that's well above the barrier where we see ordering. And you see also these jumps. So apparently there are some local events where things rearrange and then gets a bit more ordered. But overall, even after here 1.5 hours, we didn't get much below 18, so it doesn't go a lot. But if you do this swap, then immediately after a few seconds already you're at 16. So things are many, many orders of magnitude faster, and you can actually relax much better.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So just to be clear, this is a constant NVT.
Yeah, this is a constant density. Yeah, NVT. Yeah, and what you also see here is that now we see here this almost linear slope, and then it becomes constant. So what's actually happening here, there's crystallization happening now in this polysphere system with these swaps. So now with swaps, you can access times that are much, much longer. Depending on the density, they can be 6 to 9 orders of magnitude longer than what you can get with just without the swaps. That's also what Berthier and others in the glass community are utilizing to relax their glasses, and then we have some equilibration here. So let's look at how this actually, what kind of crystals you get. Well, first of all, these are snapshots, and one of them is with swap and the other one without swap, and one of them is ordered and the other one is disordered. But I would claim you cannot tell the difference, or at least I cannot. It looks very delicious. That shows that order can be sometimes very difficult to detect.
What's the definition of order then?
Well, I will show you. So okay, this one is without swap, this one is swap, so this one is actually ordered, but I will show you in a second what it is.
In the spirit of the World Cup, I think that's just to gamble or bet or something. Which
Yeah, but I think it's impossible, so I will not set up for an impossible bet. Yeah, so what we do here is a radial distribution function. So that's essentially the distribution of care distances in our sample. And they always look like this. They have like because they are hard spheres, there are no spheres at short distance. And there's a first peak, these are the first nearest neighbors, there's second nearest neighbors, and then it sort of oscillates out and it becomes constant at 1. This is sort of how it looks like for a glass or for a liquid, or always looks like that. And if you also compare no swap, it doesn't look so very different.
Wait, what's your sigma? This is a pi-dispersed system.
No, this is a polydispersed system. This is Gaussian distribution.
But then still, what's your signal?
Signal?
So your signal is normalized by a signal. Is it the mean radius? Is it-
Here, you mean?
The horizontal.
Yeah, this goes to 1 in the infinite distance.
The x-axis is the right distance r of a sigma.
This is the unit of distance.
Oh, sigma. Sigma is the mean radius. So the center of the Gaussian, essentially, and yeah, that's where the peak is. And what you do see for the green one, actually, it becomes here a bit of it develops a shoulder. This peak gets a little bit higher, but overall, it's very subtle difference. But what helps is if you do what's called a bond order diagram. So this looks, and this is what we mean with order here. We sit on one particle, and we take the first peak, and we check which direction is my neighbor sitting at. And this is a histogram on the surface of the sphere. And this is what it looks like for this sample. So it's more or less like random. It looks a little bit like the microwave background, but there's actually no structure here. And this one now it looks like for this one. And now you see, I mean, it's very noisy because it's just one snapshot, but you see there's some, like this means a high intensity, a lot of bonds, and black means a few bonds. So there's some structure appearing here. So that means there is sort of certain distances that appear more frequently in the neighbor statistics.
Direction.
Direction, yes, thank you. You were really paying attention. That's great.
What was the standard deviation there in August first week?
Sorry?
What was August first?
This was 12%. So this was way above where you would get order normally. But with the swap, we can get ordering. And the ordering, this is what it this is a larger simulation than what I showed you before, because this one actually ran for probably a month or so. So my student ran it for as long as it makes sense on a computer. And what you do here is you color the particles by a coordination number. So you have 12, 14, 15, 16. This is actually what people that know about Frank-Kasper phases. These are the Frank-Kasper coordination numbers. There are also others. And the majority here are Frank-Kasper neighbors. So that means it's like a Frank-Kasper phase. It's there's a lot of disorder still in there. There are some orders. So there's some crystallization to a Frank-Kasper phase. And also you can now clearly see there's some kind of ordering. Here's some layering. There's something green. So there's now you see that there's order, what was much harder to see before. And now you can actually start analyzing this order. And here is a cut through the sample. We make the particles a bit smaller so you can see inside. And you see it's a very complicated structure. So you have these ring-like clusters and you have these green ones. And I will, again, this is the bond order diagram, now average and get a bit nicer. This is a diffraction pattern. So there are apparently some very complicated structures you can crystallize when you follow these systems. And to get the image I just showed you, we can do this as follows. We start here with our sample. We then take here a cut. So essentially this cut is like this in here. We just cut perpendicular to the layers. Then we rotate it around. We look from the top. You see some structure here. When you look long enough, you see here a unit cell. And you take out the unit cell. And then you see here different features like this big ring and this small rhomb. And the big ring, the small rhomb is something that's well known. This is actually the basic unit in a Labes phase. The center part is a free alpha polyhedra, and these red ones are tetrahedra. And you can in principle take this as a tile, and then when you take this rhomb, you can tile it either periodically. And you get one type of Labes phase, I think it's the C15, and if you do it alternatingly, you get a C14. It's a little bit like in XCC and HCP, you can either have an ABC stacking or an AB-AB stacking, and then you get FCC HCP, just like that in Labes phase, you have these different Labes phases, and they're actually quite related to FCC, BCC. And then you have here these center ones, which are these very complicated channels. And yeah, they have different shells. The center is like a row of like icosahedra, so a column. Then you have another, and you have outer shells. You have actually different layers. So here is the center. Here's the first, second, and the third shell over here, which are shown on the left. So the really complicated structure, and this is sort of the nicest we got out of this. we never got like a really nice big crystal, but it shows there are very complicated things happening when you go to polydispersed systems.
There's the coordination number that you indicated there. Does that relate to the dispersity of the particles, the size of the particles?
Yes, yes. Actually, if you look carefully, I don't have an image here, but if you look carefully, maybe you see it here a little bit. The particles that have a high coordination number, they tend to be larger. You see the green ones are typically pretty large, and the red ones that have smaller coordination number are smaller. So that means the large particles sort of go, the system sort of locally sorts itself into some particles playing the role of large atoms and some particles playing the role of small atoms.
But is it also true that if you have a what you would call a non-ordered case, that this correlation is weaker between size and coordination?
I didn't analyze it. We could study it.
I mean, that's
Probably.
that's
Probably.
we should talk about that.
I mean, you can, yeah. I don't know. I can just speculate. So this is what, and we didn't. This is about how far we got. Like there's probably more structures here, but the simulations already take a month, even with these very advanced simulation algorithms. So it's pretty slow process. But clearly, even highly polydispersed systems, there can be some ordering. So here's sort of doing this more systematically now. This is a diagram you've seen from Zaccarelli et al. Before. So here's packing fraction, dispersity, we read it, their calculation without swaps, we get essentially the same. So only 1 or 2 points are different. So it's 100% the same. And then when we add swaps, it goes like this. And I can go back and forth. So you see essentially what happens is you get on this side, you get now new types of order. You get here in purple, that's this FK. So these are these Frank-Casper phases. And we didn't attempt in this work to really say which Frank-Casper phase it is. We see that they're all coordinated 12, 14, 15, 16. And some of those simulations seem to be very complicated, but there might be several Frank-Casper phases and you can't really split this up. And then we see a very high polydispersity, above 12%, up to 16%. We see lattice phases. So this is this ROM. I actually have this here. So here are my lattice phases here, these ROMs that we've seen before, and they form different types. So they're all parallel. So the ROM, you can actually draw the ROM in 2 directions, either in this direction or in this direction. So this is called the C15 phase. They're all parallel. Here they're alternating. So you see here the green pairs. They go zigzag, and here they're all parallel. So we see both of these lattice phases in there, and we don't know which one is more stable, but they form at very high polydispersity. And again, the high coordinations, so 16, are typically covered by the large particles, and the low coordination red are covered by the small particles. And then there is some mass here. We don't yet know if all the particles that are in the middle get pushed here, but that's one possibility. But at least that's what we got so far. So let's go. Well, this is at least a possibility how you can. Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask about this. I'm just trying to think about the structure of this. The blue parts there, is that pretty much an amorphous regime that's in there? So this is like a parent crystal. This is concept of a parent crystal where you have crystalline domains that are kind of separated by amorphous regime. Yeah. You have polycrystal where you have brain boundaries.
That I can't answer right now. There are 2 possibilities. Either this is not fully relaxed yet, and it's a crystal in the process of forming, and if I wait longer, eventually this will just grow and fill it.
Or the tails of your distribution have to go.
That's the second possibility, that you just argue, well, I have some waste. If I take all the small particles out, all the large, and then sort of the stuff in the middle or on the tail, I put it. Like in alloys, that's very well known. If you have like a multi-component mixture, then you form a nice crystal, and then sort of the waste is sort of pushed out, and it's like on the surface, which is a possibility here. We didn't analyze that yet. And yeah.
Forgive me for asking a rude question.
Yeah.
But what is the point of this? The method of annealing that you're using is not a realistic one in any sense. You're searching for some kind of ground state in an artificial way, which is not available to nature. So what is the take home message?
Well, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. Wait. First of all, it is in a way an acceleration to relaxation, but it's going to like the free energy minimum. Like we're not violating statistical mechanics. We're obeying detailed balance when we do these swaps. I should have said that before. So we are guaranteed to go to an equilibrium that you would also reach without swaps, just much quicker.
Okay.
But you're right in the sense is, can nature actually utilize this process? And that's actually the next slide where I come to, and there are some experimental systems besides the opals that I mentioned, where it's still not fully clear how it works there. But there are two systems I want to mention here. One is nanoparticles with ligands. So these are small gold nanoparticles. They don't necessarily have to have exactly this shape, but they're small crystals of gold. They have ligands on the surface. And 2 years ago, there was this work where they used polydispersed gold nanoparticles and they get a lattice phase. Not very large, but at least they can analyze and see there's a lattice phase. So apparently there is something.
So could I, because I've never heard the word lattice phase
Yeah.
before. What is that?
The lattice phase is a phase that is traditionally known in alloys. It's actually the most common binary alloy phase. That's has more than 1,000 occurrences in binary phase diagrams. So it's maybe the same importance to as for monodispersed system it has for binary systems. So it's like the standard, most common binary dispersed systems. Exactly.
Yeah, Michael, a technical question. How do you realize the polydispersity in the simulation?
I just take radii by randomly. I use random numbers to choose the size of the spheres at the beginning, and I have a Gaussian distribution.
Okay.
And I mean, it's a finite system, so I approximate it. So, and there's this other system, which actually also was one of the motivators to do these simulations, because I met Manhatapa in, where did we meet? At the, I don't remember, but he showed me this work, and that was quite interesting. So these are my cells, and that maybe goes slowly in the direction to answer Dennis's questions. So these are surfactants. They have a hydrophobic tail or heads and a hydrophilic, hydrophobic hydrophilic combination, and they form these small spheres. And these spheres can also form crystals, just like you can get from colloids. But what is a bit different from the colloids is that now this is a very dynamic object. So you have these surfactants and they form spheres. The surfactant can sort of leave a micelle and go to another micelle, or it can. So here's sort of an experimental image where they did tomography of also getting a C14, C15 lattice phase. And what they see is that they get something what they call dynamic dispersity. So you start out with, if these micelles are all far apart, they all have roughly the same size. But then when you crystallize, what happens is that some of the micelles can grow on the expense of the other micelles, and you can develop actually such a binary crystal just by mass transport in the sample. And this is also known in alloys. It's not very well discussed, but if you have there are, for example, in manganese is the elemental metal with a very complicated crystal structure called beta manganese. And what happens there is that some of the manganese atoms, they gather a little bit more electrons, and other manganese atoms give up electrons. So essentially the manganese, they make a compromise. I take some up, you give some up, and then you get this what's called a dynamic dispersity, what would be called dynamic dispersity. And this explains in micelles how you can get these binary crystals from something that in principle is polydispersed, but also in some alloys, and maybe that helps a bit to answer why this could be relevant, because it explains what happens in these systems. And of course, the simulation are highly simplified, but they allow us to study this systematically in a very simple model system. Okay, before we go on, any questions for the polydispersed? Otherwise, I would.
I have one question about the bond order diagrams. The bond order diagram. these are the directions of the neighbors, basically, of the contacts.
Yes.
And are these relative to an absolute direction, or are they sort of rotated for every particle so that?
Well, there is, of course, you have to choose. It's when you look at the directions, you get a distribution on the surface of the sphere, and then when you make a picture, you have to choose a direction. And you can either do it.
But so I guess what I'm asking is you're not taking one of the directions for every particle and aligning that direction for every.
No, you have a global coordinate system, and that is fixed.
Okay.
And like here it's a random orientation. That's why this looks not super highly symmetric. But of course, then when you have this, just like when you take a diffraction pattern, you can orient it in a high symmetry direction, and then it looks nicer. That's what's done here. This one looks actually, this is pseudo tenfold. It's like a Frank Casper phase, which is, it's not a quasi-crystal, but it has pseudo tenfold symmetry, and we look in this direction. Okay, because we also look here in the direction of these rings. So this orientation matches this orientation. Okay, but we'll see one of the diagrams also in the second part. Okay, so I will now talk about another system, magic number clusters. So this one is I actually have this picture larger. This one is another mineral that's found. It's a pyrite. Pyrite is one of the most common minerals on Earth. Again, this is not a sort of super exotic. This is something that's actually the most abundant sulfide mineral on Earth. It's also called fool's gold. So I even found that in my garden at one point. And this is a special type of pyrite, which is called a rhomboidal pyrite or pyrite rhomboids. So this looks like these small sphere clusters. And it's called rhomboidal pyrite from this French term framboise, called raspberry, because it looks a little bit like small raspberries. And then people found that maybe in the early times of electron microscopy, because you cannot quite see that with a light microscope. I'm not sure, probably it's too small for light microscope. But people found that many decades ago, and they didn't know where this comes from. There's a book by actually a whole book on pyrites, which talks about the history, and I can give you the reference. I don't have it here on my slides, unfortunately. And so people at the beginning, they thought maybe it's some kind of mineral. There's some animals fossilized, or maybe it's some excretion of some animals. They didn't know where this came from. But now we know this is just a real mineral that forms even in the absence of any organic life. So this one actually here is pretty old, millions of years old, and they have different sizes. And one of the outcomes, here's David Rickard. He's from Cardiff University, a mineralogist from there, and we had a lot of correspondence on this because, as I will show you later, in another system, we did study these kind of crystallization processes of these rhomboids, and one of the outcomes was that nowadays it's known how these rhomboids form. That was already known before we did it, but also we can estimate the time of formation. So this, for example, takes a couple of days. So it's a process essentially you have geologically, you have a solution of these nanocrystals or mesocrystals in nature, and then it dries out and it forms droplets, and these droplets crystallize into these clusters.
Can I ask you one question, which I think your scale probably reveals for me, but maybe it doesn't. It looks like there's some self-similarity, and I'm wondering whether if you go down to one more level, which is still at the 100 nanometer scale, whether you also have the rhomboidal, those little guys. Or is this the lowest?
The little guys.
With the little guys, do they also have this sort of?
You see it better here. So the little guys are nanocrystals. So depending on which sample you're at, they can be more spherical. They can also be polyhedral. So this is a particularly nice sample. So meaning the particles have all very defined shape. And they're also nearly monodisperse. So now we are going a little bit away from the polar dispersity. And if they are in here, they look a bit like octahedra, somewhat common. And this shape is actually the wolf shape, so that has to do with the crystal structure. In this case, it's FCC, or yeah, not it's a binary because it's sulfide, but essentially you can think of, you can get the same with the FCC structure. Here they are more like a bit truncated octahedra. And what fascinated me here is that it also forms some symmetry. So not only do they form the clusters, but the cluster itself, they order. So but there's still a hierarchy. These particles are crystalline, single crystals, and then they form this polycrystalline sample. So here, iron sulfide is the chemical compound. So this is here from Japan. So they just take this out of the ground from the drill core, and it's just found like this. So my colleague Nicholas Vogel from Erlangen, he does experiments and he makes these artificial, what we call artificial framboids. So these are now, this is different material. These are polystyrene spheres, very similar to what we might hear in the afternoon by Vinny. And this is just used for publicity. There's no big sign, but it shows very nice how you can get smaller and larger of these spheres. So let's come back to math and let's look a little bit of what happens here geometrically. So when you have spheres, now equal diameter spheres, you can ask yourself, what is the local structure of putting spheres together? And there are two extreme cases. One is the packing dominated case, which is shown here, where you try to cramp the sphere such that globally it's a densest packing. And as many of you will know, the densest packing of spheres, the Kepler problem, is 74%, and it's in the FCC structure. In the FCC structure, we have coordination number 12. So that's also what we saw in the polar dispersed system. This is here, we have a lot of squares and triangles here on the surface, and these are the octahedral and tetrahedral voids on the FCC packing. On the other hand, if you look at the local optimum, then what is better than the FCC packing is an icosahedral packing. And it's better from the perspective of entropy, because if you do this, it's very small rearrangement of the particles because it still has coordination number 12. You can introduce gaps here by sort of symmetrizing the structure from cubic symmetry to icosahedral symmetry. And these gaps, 5% distance here between the particle, 5% in terms of the radius, add entropy to the system and make this actually entropically more stable. And the competition of these two local order rings is what makes spheres a bit special, and what also explains why in glasses you often have icosahedral order, because if you do it quickly, you get something like this, and why in the crystal, well, you go to densest packing, you eventually end up here. And the Frank-Casper phases you've seen before, they are sort of a compromise. They are still pretty close to icosahedral order, not perfectly, but they sort of sacrifice density to get more icosahedral order. That's also why we do see them sort of as intermediate states in our simulations. And then when you have these icosahedral clusters, you can do something that goes back to another crystallographer, Alan McKay, in 1962. He said you can add shells. You can start with a single icosahedron. You can add, here's a triangle. On top of the triangle, you can add a bigger triangle. You get here, you see a bigger triangle made from 6 spheres. Here it's just 3 spheres. And then you can go on, you can go to 10 spheres. And you can grow this shell by shell, layer by layer outwards. And there's even a formula. You can say the total number of spheres, because it's in 3 dimensions, it's a cubic formula. And the special numbers here are 13, so 12 icosahedron plus 1 in the center, 55, and then 147. Again, this is something super well known, and people studied that a lot already in the 80s and 90s. So this is again some pretty old work here from clusters of xenon atoms. So this is essentially you take xenon at low temperature, and it forms clusters in vacuum, and you do a mass spectroscopy of these clusters, and you do that here as a function of size, cluster size, or mass essentially, and you do see these peaks. So the peaks in are the individual states. So you have 1, 2, 3, or for every single number of particles in the cluster, you have a peak, and you see some special places So 13 is a little bit higher. And then at 55, you see here a drop off. So apparently something happens at 55. And then if you continue here, so this is just continued over here. You see here another drop off at 147. So that means in these xenon clusters, apparently these Mackay clusters play a role, and the stability of these clusters has to do with the complete clusters are a little bit more stable. This is why these clusters are also called magic number clusters. It's a little bit like in the periodic table where you, in the electron shell is complete, you're a bit more stable, and you see the same here in these clusters. And you can even go on. So this is work from the 90s, where now they did spectroscopy on sodium clusters, and you go to much larger clusters, 20,000, and you see these oscillations in the frequency of seeing certain sizes, which shows that certain sizes are more stable or more common than other sizes. And again, these are sort of magic number clusters. Whenever you have a maximum, we would call this a magic number. When you have a minimum, it's like a non-magic number cluster. But it's smeared out because of thermodynamics and so on. So my colleague, he has this assembly line for colloidal crystals. So this is microfluidics. So this is oil here in water, and in these oil droplets, it looks like this. So you have monodisperse emulsion of small colloids. Oops, that was too fast. So there are polystyrene colloids, roughly 100 to 100,000. We can control the number by controlling the size of the droplets and by controlling the concentration of the colloids in solution. Of course, it's not accurate, but again, you get some distribution and you can control it somewhat. And then you can crystallize this, and this is sort of, again, another publicity image, which is mostly for a nice beauty shown here. But we can get a lot of these clusters, and if you zoom in, some of these clusters are very, very symmetric. They have these axial symmetry that we've seen in the rhomboidal pyrite.
So these are formed by evaporating the
Yes,
around.
I should have said that. Yes, we take these droplets, and then the droplet is evaporated, so it's pulled together, and then it's packing or self-assembling or a mix of the two, these clusters. And what you get here is essentially a it's like a polycrystalline cluster. There are domains of FCC. There are 20 domains of FCC that are arranged with icosahedral symmetry in a symmetric fashion. And plus, you see also in the surface, there are these triangular domains, these square domains. And here is sort of, this is called the vertex region. This is the edge region. This is the face region. And this one is actually a generalization of a Mackay cluster. This is called an anti-Mackay cluster. So what you do is you start forming the Mackay layers in an FCC fashion, and you introduce a stacking fault, HCP stacking fault. Then you continue with FCC to the outside. And you can also show you can only introduce a stacking fault once, exactly once. You cannot do it more for geometric reasons. And this gives us the anti-Mackay classes. And by counting here the number of the geometry of these rectangles, we can say how many Mackay layers and how many anti-Mackay layers we have. I will show you this in a second. Actually, here's one of the students, Chu Wei Wang. He spent many sleepless hours under the electron microscope looking at hundreds of these clusters and looking at the most beautiful ones. And those are the ones he found. And some are a little bit smaller, some are a little bit larger. Here you see the number of particles which we estimate from the model. So here is our model, the geometric construction. So here is the number of particles, and we introduce a numbering scheme shown here. So the big number is the number of layers. So these are all magic number clusters. So these are all high symmetry clusters. Number of layers, and the small number is the number of anti-Mackay layers. So it's like we need two numbers. And actually, the small number has to do with here with the size of the rectangle. So 2 means the rectangle here is 3 across. It's here 3 across. And here's where you would appear as a 3. Here's 4 across the rectangle. Here we have a 13.5 across. So by looking on the outside, we can identify these numbers. And we can also count here the size the size on this diagonal, and then you can sort of get these numbers. So again, this is experiment, but our contribution now was to do simulation, so we can also study this same process in simulation. So these are the same kind of event-driven molecular dynamics simulations you've seen before in a very small system. Now you have to do a confinement of in a sphere. So the spheres, they bounce off from a hard spherical confinement. And we can do that in a bit more sophisticated here in a larger system. So that's a real system, a real simulation, where we do a bit of post-processing. Again, you see here the Bondo diagram we've seen before. This one is sort of the you sit in the center of the sphere, you look outwards, and you project here the position of the particles, and not all particles, but the colored particles. So what are the colored particles? The colored particles are, we use an algorithm to detect ordered particles in the system. So like like you can think of like a Steinhardt autoparameter for those that know this term. And then you can get the crystalline grains in the system. So this is sort of at the beginning where we have some grains, but it's not perfectly ordered. And as I run it, you will see that the grains, they will grow. And so at the beginning it fluctuates. And then over time, you see sort of a crystallization of this hexahedral cluster. And we analyze this process a lot. And due to time constraints, I will not have full time to talk about all the aspects, but those of you that are interested should just talk to me separately. But I will show you some other things we can do. Namely, we can do free energy calculations of these clusters. So we wanted to get a diagram which looks like the mass spectrum, where we see certain diameters are more stable or more better than others, to really argue they're also really thermodynamically magic number clusters in our system. So we did free energy calculations. This is not simple for these clusters because the clusters is only partially ordered, and also because it's a relatively slow evolving system. So the diagram here that we ended up then really showing that the free energy diagram, that took us probably 2 years to do the calculation. But at the end here from the simulation, you see here, this is sort of the free energy offset, some background. Again, this would probably take quite a bit of time to explain, but if you're interested, I can explain it to you separately. It shows us sort of the relative stability as we change the size of the cluster. And we see for some radii, for some sizes, so here's the number of particles, and it's connected to the radii because this is a 53% density, so constant volume. So we see for certain radii, it's more stable, free energy is lower. And for other radii, it's less stable, the free energy is higher. And this is the free energy per particle. So we see that the difference we had to resolve is like in the tens of kT range in free energy, and even here like hundreds of kT. So pretty small free energy differences, but we do see these magic number oscillations.
And you're saying if you go farther to the right, FCC has to win ultimately?
Yes, that's the other thing. Yeah, I didn't say it here. We also compare to FCC clusters. So those we didn't simulate long enough that they actually revert to something else. But FCC is less stable for these, and it does cross somewhere at 10,000, 20,000. Eventually it crosses. It depends on density where exactly it crosses. But we know in the bulk hard spheres, FCC is stable, but for finite systems, and there's also, we are not the first one to talk about this. I should have put also reference Marianne Dijkstra and Alfons van Bladeren. They have done the same work like this in Nature Physics 2015. But we sort of did these high precision free energy calculations. And now I will have a few more slides. And now we can start looking a bit more in detail what happens. So here we zoom in on this regime where we see minimum and maximum. The minimum is sort of the magic number regime. Here here when it goes up, this is sort of off magic number. And then we can look at simulation outcomes and later also in experiments. How does the cluster look like there? So here's a comparison of a magic number and an off magic number cluster. So the magic number clusters over here in the top row, they are pretty ordered. The Bondon diagram is super nice, nice peaks. And when we go to off magic number clusters, we see more defects, and also we see this characteristic splitting of the Bondon diagram. So we see now double peaks. I think, yeah, you're seeing doubles, but what happens, you can illustrate that on an icosahedron. So the icosahedron here is 20 grains, 20 FCC grains, and the FCC grains actually are not super happy, which is why this doesn't form in a bulk, because the angle here, the tetrahedron angle is something like 70.59, 70.6 degrees, but in FCC, the angle is a little bit smaller. So this wants to actually contract, but it cannot because it has this icosahedral symmetry. And what happens when you're off magic number, then this rips open. This forms here like a wedge, and in this wedge you have defects. So we have a defective icosahedral cluster, which is why you see here we see the splitting of the wedges, and we can analyze that in an experiment as well. So here is electron tomography analysis of such a non-magic number clusters. We now see the defects here in the wedge. We can compare that to our simulation, and it works pretty nicely. So that means we can understand the complete range of magic number and off magic number clusters. And here's another video of the actual tomography. So we also saw other types of clusters. So here's where you take one of these clusters, you put it under an electron microscope, you look from different directions, and then you rotate it around. And then when you do this, you can then reconstruct the cluster. So here's a reconstruction of this cluster. So we have the position of all the colloids, and this is actually something. This is the newest work which was just published, accepted a few days ago. So we have a cluster which has this fivefold symmetry. So this is not an icosahedral cluster, this is a decahedral cluster. And I don't have super much time, I'm running out of time, so I will skip a few slides, but I will just point you to the most important parts. Namely, there is now a bifurcation. You can get icosahedral clusters, you can get decahedral clusters, and it depends a bit on the size. So what I told you before was a bit of a simplification, namely that there's another line here in the free energy. This is the same diagram we've seen before. And now with yellow, we have the decahedral cluster, and the decahedral cluster sometimes can compete with the icosahedral cluster. But still, when we do statistics, what you see here, we see, depending on the size, for a small cluster, we see 80 to 90% icosahedral clusters, very few decahedral clusters, which is why I have not shown them to you before. They're super rare. And we can now go on and explain why they are rare. And it's not, maybe just as a spoiler, it's not thermodynamics, because as you see here, the decahedral clusters can sometimes be even more stable. So yellow is below red. Red is sort of it's below blue. Blue is icosahedral, yellow is decahedral, but it has to do with kinetics. So there's you can study this quite in detail and explain why different symmetries appear. And I will just skip through this. And if you're interested, just talk to me and I can give you the preprint. We can explain why they work. Maybe just last part we can also do, or my colleagues can do, look at photonic color. I will put these small balls under the light microscope, and then you look. Here's a static image. Here's a video. You sort of look on the look at these clusters, and they look a bit like marbles. We have a very characteristic sign, like here's a threefold, twofold sign. That has to do with the fact that in icosahedron, here's fivefold symmetry. Icosahedral has twofold, threefold, fivefold directions. Plus, here in the movie, you see also some other clusters. For example, maybe if I go here, over here, for example, this is one with stripes. This is an FCC cluster. Over here, we have something that's like a semicircle. That's actually a decahedron cluster. So we can sort of use a light microscope to tell the cluster type apart pretty easily. And then we can, again, if you're interested in photonics, we have a paper about how the color appears and how you get the different characteristic signatures of the clusters. And you can do that for the decahedral, you can do that for the icosahedral. Plus, you can use these light microscope techniques to look at the evolution of the cluster. So here's time. This is sort of an in situ observation of how this cluster forms. It starts from a liquid, no color, or just grayish color, and then it goes through the process. And maybe just as a very quick summary of what we know, without really proving it to you here, but summary of what we know how this forms. So you start with a ball of more or less disordered colloids inside. Then the droplet shrinks, so the colloids get squished together. What happens is they start forming order on the layers. So there's layering on the surface. It's a little bit like a liquid crystal, like a smactic liquid crystal. There's layering, but no order within the layers. That's sort of when we see this dot here, and this dot gets brighter. And then what happens in the layers on the outside, you form crystals. You form crystals with icosahedral symmetry. So you get an icosahedral templating from the outside. That's sort of what we see here. Then this icosahedral templating that moves inwards, it grows towards the center. Sort of when we are here, sort of here, this comes from the growing crystal here. And then eventually it grows all the way to the center. You're somewhere here, and then what happens, because the crystal is denser, it melts again on the surface. You're sort of here, and then the crystallization process is completed. So again, it starts ordering from the outside, grows to the inside, melts on the outside, and you have sort of a crystal then floating in a thin layer of liquid at the end. And then as we go on waiting longer, what happens is that the crystal slowly gets compressed further and further. The lattice constant shrinks, so the color shifts towards smaller wavelength, and we see the color change in the experiment. And we can do that. This is just published. We're just in the process of publishing. This is sort of a growth of a decahedral cluster. I go through this very quickly. You sort of see how it grows from one side, goes to the other side. And you can do here also look at the growth of the icosahedral cluster. And it's a bit hard to see here on the screen. It looks better on the computer, on the video. It looks better on the screen here. And we can also then explain. Again, I won't do that here. We can explain why icosahedral cluster and decahedral cluster have different kinetics and how that happens. So I'll just skip over this. Okay, and with this, I'm already out of time. Let me just thank my group. So we are a very diverse group of chemical engineers, material scientists, physicists, chemists, computation engineers, and we're all very math affine. But we are in the engineering department, and yeah, thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Make sure I understand, decahedral, you mean basically a fivefold version of the octahedron?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So you see that a bit here. So icosahedral, you have you start with decahedron, and then you have 20 decahedron, you get an icosahedron, and here you essentially have one fivefold axis that goes all the way through the crystal, like here.
So to make sure. I guess I had a couple of them. Maybe I'll pick one. So maybe in
Okay, so maybe I'll ask about the bond order pictures, and sort of the inverse question that came up here, right? So, so you have the global, so the two pictures you had of the ordered and the disordered. Much earlier you had this bond order picture that was like a global picture. And I'm curious, you know, if you localize, do you still like, does it have, you localize down and sort of, right, and rotate everything to line up so that you're getting basically the local bond order picture? Is it the same? I mean, I don't know whether this is like icosahedral in that particular example. And maybe you don't know,
No,
but like whether the local picture is actually going to be the same and what you have is sort of an alignment of the bond order after this kind of annealing process.
So you can think of, if you really have a crystal structure, and if you have a unit cell, then in principle, you have everything you need to know in one unit cell. So, but in the unit cell, you can have different local symmetries, especially.
Yeah, so I was just curious if you look in this left-hand picture.
You can use that actually to also as an order parameter to also distinguish different sites in a unit cell, and people have done that. But as long as you have a unit cell, in principle, you have the right statistics already, but you have a lot of noise also. These are all numerical calculations, so you need to use a cutoff to define what's the nearest neighbor, your thermal fluctuations. So yeah, you get a lot of noise, and as you make the system larger and larger, essentially what you get is just the peaks get, well, you get better statistics, everything gets smoother and better defined, but in principle, the unit cell has all the statistics.
Now I'm increasingly confused about the classification. So if you have FCC type and icosahedral type, and then you say you also have decahedral type, and sometimes these are better than the icosahedral from the point of view of free energy, right? So how much do we know about what's the actual minimum, the actual ground state for a given number of particles? And is it clear that it's any particular symmetry?
Well, now I don't have an image there, and if I had to guess, or if I had to make my best picture, so I put here n instead of, or maybe just in one axis view. So we have n size, and we start maybe at 100, and we go here maybe rapidly to let's say 100,000. We get here for the small clusters, we get, so this is free energy. We get domains where we have icosahedral and then decahedral. They alternate, actually. Yeah. So, and it will, and at one point we get FCC. So this will sort of go on for some time, and then we get FCC. So this is free energy. Whereas if you go for observation, or then you have kinetics, what we get on the axis, we get that this FCC number is shifted back. So here, maybe this is at 10,000. All these are super approximate. But if you do a simulation, we see this shifts back to maybe 50,000 to 100,000. And the majority here is like this just IH with few of a decahedral. Yeah. So that means kinetics sort of is quite important for this process because it's irreversible. If you once you are in an hexahedral, it takes a super long time to go to somewhere else.
Yeah, for the first, so the polydispersity basically. So as you already showed in one of the pictures, you have like this region of amorphous structure. Is this more actually like the small particles which are accumulating there? Because it's also in terms of the dynamics of forming these kind of crystals, it's now that if you have more like an abundance of small particles, it's easier for them to kinetically form. Such that is it maybe in nature also the case that you have like a skewed distribution more of the smaller particles which make them easier to form?
Yeah, maybe I will show you.
You might want to move your board down now.
Oh, yeah.
I think I have here in some. Yeah, here for example, this is. Oh, I can't just, I have to show it like this. So this is actually the, another slide for this work by Lucas Göring, which did experiments. That goes a bit in the direction you're asking. So what they saw, and we didn't do the analysis, so that's maybe, I already said that before, but what they saw is that they found, so these are SiO2 spheres, charged, polydispersed, and they have this initial distribution. And then they get two crystals. They get several crystals. They get BCC crystals, they get lava spaces, and FCC crystals. And they do see here certain separation of certain sizes into BCC and other sizes here. So for example, here the tetrahedral, this is for lavas. They sort of get the small and the large particles. So they do see this in experiment. So I think it is like you're saying, and you can say maybe some particles are left over and they're pushed out. I mean, there's a lot of possibility for follow-up work and studying this more detail.
I think we should, in reverse order, come back at 11:45. Rob's talk, get some coffee now, and thank Michael again.